We're going to talk about segmented turning. Um, if you are a member of the AAW and you get the journal, you'll notice that there's a lot more non-traditional work in the journal, and that includes segmenters. There's a whole chapter now of the AAW, and perhaps more than one, on segmenting. So lots of interest. The so-called father of segmented turning was a guy named Ray Allen, and he was doing it almost by himself way down in Yuma, Arizona. He was a retired engineer, and he started doing this, and his work was in the Fine Woodworking magazine before I think we even had an AAW journal, but I wasn't a member of AAW back that long. But I can remember getting that, I think it was a bowl that he had done, a checkerboard bowl, and thinking, oh my goodness, that is so incredible. And that was really one of the things that got me motivated to get started in segmented work. The other one is Malcolm Tibbetts. I didn't put his website, but he lives in Lake Tahoe. It's Tahoe Turner. And if you look at his stuff, this is his book, which I'll pass around. He's a tremendous guy, a great teacher. I've taken classes with him. Does some astounding stuff, and that book is about 10 years old. His stuff now is even more mind-boggling. Very, very different kind of work, and there are other people doing it, but he's really the pioneer. So traditionally, segmented turning really was getting a bunch of wood, going to your chop saw or your table saw, cutting a whole bunch of little segments, making rings like this, and then stacking up the rings and adding some detail to it, contrasting woods, and putting them all together, and then putting them on the lathe and forming your bowl or your vessel or whatever it was you were making. And that was segmented turning for quite a long time. Then along came a guy by the name of Mike Schuler from California, and I urge you to look at his website. I've got it listed on here, mikeschuler.com. He came up with the idea of taking a flat board, mounting it on the lathe, using a parting tool and cutting at an angle and forming rings that when you reassembled the rings, you had a bowl. And I will actually do that using, this is a gadget that Frank put together where it's a machine-mounted parting tool, and you make plunge cuts. And that really, he showed that at a symposium sometime back in the early 90s, and everybody said, oh, it's a whole new world. And it really was, and it's something simple, but nobody thought of it. And I'll do that real quickly, but the real thing that I'm going to focus on is the stack ring kind of construction, and that's what this one here is, as well as this one. This is a bowl that I made quite a few years ago. This is one of Frank's, and he's really gotten into this. He's only started doing this in the spring, and I don't know, he's made 14 or 15 of these, and he takes them to his shows and sells them. And it's an interesting technique. It's almost disarmingly simple, but it's a real challenge to get it to come out right. And you've got every step of the way has to be done quite carefully. Your glue joints have to be good, and I'll talk about each one of those steps as I get into it. So, and the 4 YouTube channels that I put here, there's probably 20 out there, but take a look at these 4. Denny Edwards really was the guy who demystified it for me, and I had seen some of this work, and he goes through it step by step. He's a kind of a woodchucky sort of guy from Pennsylvania, very down to earth, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's not a long one. Tom Lehman, it's Lohman. I think you got a corrected version. My spell checker, when I was typing this up, kept spelling the names wrong, and I'd correct it, and when I went to print it, it was still wrong. The lady in the print shop was able to scan it, put it into her computer, and correct it, so I think I have it right on your copy. Anyway, it's Tom Lohman, Lohman. Tremendous work, all kinds of work, open segmenting. He does some spectacular dizzy bowls, or he calls them twisters, I think. And then Hal Malitsky, and I urge you to look at that one too. spectacular. When you open his gallery page, you'll be overwhelmed by just the beauty of the woods that he uses. They're all very similar in style in terms of having swirls, but they're all different. But there are many more. The fourth one, Fischetti Woodworking, his tornado bowl really is a beautiful piece. It's done just like this one or this one, but he has a lot more pieces in it, and instead of looking overly busy, there's balance to it. And the reason I'm including him is he uses the same technique that I use, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The main difference, we all sort of conform to the same general steps. The difference is how we cut the rings, either on the bandsaw or in one case a CNC machine. So I'm going to backtrack. I'll just do this quickly. This is called bowl from a board, and I'll just cut these rings, and then I'll move on to talking about the stack rings. This is a jig that One Way now is selling, and the thing they sold it for was to mount a drill, like a little hand drill, on this, so you could do some kind of piercing or detail work using your drill and the indexing on the lathe. So Frank had this ingenious idea of mounting a parting tool on it, and that's what I'm going to use. I tried it at home, but this is the first time I've done a demo with it. So here we go. In terms of angle of cut, if you made every cut on this and also on the stack ring at 45 degrees, it would come out pretty well. You can modify it up to 5 or 6 degrees in either direction, and it won't really matter. The nice thing about having that angle cut is, you see all these rings. I've only glued a few of them together, but this is the way they came off the cutting process. So it already has the shape of a bowl, and it saves a tremendous amount of wood. So that's what I'm going to do here. And always wear even though we're doing a pretty minor operation, wear your face mask. We need to plug things in, or we're not going to get very far. Any questions while I'm finding the extension cord here? Just barely. I helped Frank load all this stuff up, and I heard him say extension cord several times. But anyway, it reached. So I'm going to, can you hear me? This sounds like I'm echoing like crazy. Is it all right? Okay. I'm going to cut this into 4 rings, and I think that'll be enough, because if you do a lot more, you end up with a bowl that's taller and steeper sided. I want this to be more open, and I'll show you why after I get the pieces cut. So setting the banjo at about 90 degrees to the bed. Got this pulled all the way back. Start about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in. That will be the rim of the bowl. Come back just a little bit more. Tighten everything down. You don't need a lot of speed with this. You do need to turn the lathe on. His scale is different from mine, so I'm not sure what we've got here. It's only 200 or 300 RPMs. This lathe has a lot less horsepower than mine. What's the old maxim about the best laid plans? When I did this on my lathe, I wasn't getting any of this smoking, and I think it's just because it's laboring it a little bit, and I'm spending a lot more time in the cut. So I'm not going to do the other two cuts. I'll take this one all the way through. You get the idea. And I don't want to set off Advantage Lumber's smoke alarm. Frank said he was going to put a better cutter on this, which it clearly needs. But the principle is good, and I think I'm going to get one and play around with it, because I've always done mine with a parting tool and just held it in my hand, which works, but this is much more stable. I had allotted 30 seconds for each of these cuts. I think I'm going to be a little off that. All right. He has ground this cutter on a little bit of a curve, and I think it's not, when I get into the cut, that's why it's smoking and building up the heat. So I won't do any more. But that is the technique, and it works very well with a hand parting tool, and I know that with a better tip, it will work fine with this, and I'll show you. Yeah. No, I think it's on the higher speed. That's why it's stalling it out. Yeah. But So this goes on here, and then I'll make another cut further in, and then a third cut, and I'll have 4 pieces of wood. And then you've got a little bit of a choice when you go to put it. You can't really see the colors of the wood because of the burn marks, but this will be what I call a checkerboard bowl, where when you're looking at it at the end, you'll see the alternating colors, and it has the appearance of a checkerboard. But you can also put them at an angle, and you'll end up with something that's a little bit more like this one here, where it's kind of stepped down. So you're not limited to just one assembly type. But this is a great technique, and this is a good way to start doing segmented work, obviously with a better knife than the one I'm showing you. But I've done hundreds of bowls like this just using a regular parting tool, and it is a good technique. Okay, on to the stack ring, which is really the subject of the meeting, of the demo, I mean. In order to get this kind of variety, you need to have contrasting woods. And so your first step in doing this is to come right here to Advantage Lumber, buy 4 or 5 different kinds of lumber, and go for the ones that have the most contrast. So get some walnut, some cherry, some maple, they've got red heart, they've got bloodwood, padauk, quite a few with a lot of good color in them. And if you want to add some accent colors, there is a company, and they have a nice website online where you can buy stained plywood. It's called Spectra Ply, and the name of the company is Cousineau, Cousineau, and they're up my way in northern Maine, and that's all they do is make plywood, and they make it in big 24 by 36 inch billets, 1, 2, and 3 inch thick, and most of it is for making gun stocks, which is why they make them in small billets. But they had so many cutoffs and so many wood turners were asking them for scraps that they decided they could make a whole nother business out of it. And so when you go on their website, you'll see hundreds of different kinds of color. So colors that you can't get here at Advantage Lumber, you can get from Cousineau wood products. And it makes just a nice little accent. In this one here, I just put a tiny little stripe in, and it really makes it pop. Quite a bit of the striping in this bowl is also the Spectra Ply. So that's a nice way to add some bling to your bowl. The next step, some competition. The next step is to cut your wood into strips, narrow, wide, it doesn't really matter, but you want to end up with a block of wood that's about 2 inches thick. It really will look like a cutting board. And this is one of Frank's that he loaned me for tonight. And you can see how he's lined up all these different types of wood. And the nice thing about it is that you don't really have to have them in any particular order. They can go any way you want. You don't need symmetry. You don't have to have purple hard here, maple here, et cetera, et cetera. You can do it anyway. And it just adds more interest to the bowl. You'll see that in his bowl. There's no particular order to it. The thing that creates the design is how he assembles them after he's made the rings. So you've got a great big thick chunk of wood. You go to your bandsaw and you make 4 or 5 small planks out of it. And one trick that Malcolm Tibbetts showed me, a lot of us have trouble resawing wide pieces of wood. Our bandsaw drift, if you've ever gone on YouTube and looked at some videos, everybody's got an opinion about what makes a bandsaw drift. And there is some important tune-up work to do. But if you've got a big wide one like this, run it across the table saw first. Make a 2-inch cut here and another 2-inch cut here. And then go ahead or you can do it on the end too. Then go to the bandsaw. And because you've got those guides for the blade, the blade is much less likely to drift. Otherwise, you'll start here with a nice 3/8 of an inch piece here, and you'll end up with 1/8 down here. It's very tricky to do resawing really well on a bandsaw. So if you use that little trick, I think that will save you a lot of grief. So, okay, you've got 4 or 5 boards, depending on how thick you want to make your rings. The most essential tool really for doing this kind of work is a drum sander, because you can plane thicker pieces, but when you get down to something below a 1/4 inch, as you've probably all found out, it'll start sniping and it'll start tearing the wood out. You can put it on top of a piece of MDF, but that's also a slippery slope. So there'll be so many other places where you will need a drum sander. When you go to put rings like this, you cannot take a ring like this and put it through a planer. It will just chew it up and spit it out into your dust collector. So a drum sander is pretty essential. So if you're going to do it, and I'll talk later about some classes that I'm going to hold, you don't have to buy one yet. You can come and use mine if you're interested in trying it. So, okay, now you've got 4 planks. The next step will be the whole idea. Can everybody hear me all right over the fan? I guess it's loud enough. The whole idea of this technique is that you're creating all these rings, and each ring is approximately a 1/2 inch smaller than the previous one, and so you just keep making them smaller and smaller. And to do that, we don't really have our overhead camera tonight, so I'll hold up 2 of these. So this is the way I've laid them out. And just focus on one. I'm covering up the numbers, but this is rings number 1, 4, 7, and 10. And all I do is just make the compass a 1/4 inch smaller, and I go from this one to the next one to the next one, and then I go to the last one, then back to the first one, and as long as I've done my layout correctly, I'm going to end up with rings that are progressively smaller. And it's really a neat system. It works very well. You can make a little measuring tool, but you can just do it with a tape measure of just marking it off. And so you lay out those rings. You've got now 3 or 4 boards with circles like this. The next part is where there's a lot of variation in how people do it. What Frank does is he will attach his piece, hold up one of his, he'll center it, and then screw it or hot melt glue it onto this piece of MDF. He's put a little tenon on the back and put it on the lathe, and he has what's called a ring master, but you can make these cuts with just a small parting tool as well. You don't have to invest in this tool. It's kind of a neat tool. You mount it on the lathe, and it's got these little cutters, and you can index it, you can adjust the angle, and then you crank it in. It's just like one of the little vices that you get for like on your drill press. Very small thread on the screw, and that feeds the same principle as what I was attempting to do over there, where you're feeding it in using a mechanical aid. But as I said, you can do it all with a parting tool if you want. The way I do them, and it's in the YouTube video, the last YouTube video for Shetty Woodworking, he makes his blanks and he does not glue the center glue joint. And by doing that, and you can see how I've done this, I've taped them together temporarily with some painter's tape so I can do my layout. So then I will take this piece, turn the table on my bandsaw up to about 45 degrees, and then make these cuts. And then the next part will be gluing, but I've had very good luck doing that. The only caveat is that when you're doing your block, you want to be sure that you have good surfaces here because they are going to get glued together. So make sure those are smooth. So if you need to, just run them over your jointer just to smooth them up while it's in block form before you've done your resawing. So now you've made all these cuts, and you've got a whole bunch of pieces like this, and you glue them all together. And because we don't have an overhead camera, I glue them on a flat surface. So I'll talk you through it rather than actually do it. But what I do is I put a small amount of glue on, and I like Titebond 3, but you can use number 2. The only caveat about using Titebond 3 is that if you're using light colored woods, it's going to show in the glue joint just slightly. But as long as the wood is darker, I really prefer Titebond 3 because you get more working time. It's a little more user friendly in terms of how hard it is. Titebond 2 gets very brittle, whereas this stuff just has a slight amount of malleability to it. So this is my preference, but whatever you like to work with, don't use Titebond Original if it's a bowl, because eventually it will be near water, and they say it is not waterproof. The other 2 and 3 are waterproof. So all I do to glue these together, a little drop of glue here, put them on a nice flat surface, rub them a little bit, and then I take a Jorgensen clamp and very gently clamp them together. And you want to be careful not to apply too much clamping pressure, because the pieces will split and come apart. So what I usually do to be sure I'm not is, instead of cranking it out here, just crank it by grabbing a hold of the threads, and then just because you don't have good purchase on it, you can't over tighten it. And I've had very good luck clamping all these with this. And when I'm doing a bowl, I've got a big 8-foot long chunk of granite in my workshop. I clear it all off, lay everything out, get all my clamps out, and do them all at the same time. And it works very well. You only need to leave it clamped for maybe a half an hour. Then you can set it all aside and wait for a day until the glue is fully cured. So at that point, you've got your rings. The next step is to, a lot of segmenters, when they were working with larger pieces, would start with a base and build the bowl up. I do just the opposite, because I'm working with fairly flimsy rings. It's more stable to start with the rim. So what I do is I take my rim and mount it on a piece of MDF, and in this case I've got a tenon on it that fits into my chuck. I always like to make the rim a little bit contrasting, so in this case I use some Red Heart. This is a neat jig to glue up your rim. It's called a string clamp, and you cut your pieces, and I'll talk about that in a second. Lay them out here, glue it in 2 halves, touch up the 2 halves on your disc sander, and then glue the 2 halves together. I used to cut all my segments with a chop saw, and I did that for 15 years. And then good old YouTube, I was watching a guy named Jerry Bennett, who is a very well-known segmented turner. I think he's from Louisiana. Invented a thing called a wedgie board. And I thought, well, that's kind of a funny name for a woodworking tool. But this is what it is. And you've all worked with cross-cutting sleds. All this is a sled that's dedicated to cut only one angle. And I have a bunch of them in my shop for 12 segments, 20, 16, 24, etc. So this wedgie sled is set up for 24 segments. You determine how much wood you need by just the diameter of your bowl times pi will give you the circumference, and that's the length of the segments. You want a little bit extra because when you're down close to the end of your piece, you got to have some way to hold it. So for this rim, I think I needed 48 inches, and I just cut a piece about 52 inches. So you're not breaking the 3-inch rule. You really, once the piece gets fairly small, it becomes a little unstable, and you just want to keep your fingers away from that. But this is a great way to cut. I think I have a 60 tooth blade on my table saw, which is a little more oriented toward cross-cutting than ripping, but it's a good combination blade. I get a finish, and I don't have to do any sanding at all. Dave? The guy that did this, his name's Jerry Bennett. And he's got a website. He's as well known for his guitar and fiddle playing as he is for his wood turning stuff, but he has quite a few shop aids like that. Okay, so we've got the, we've made our rim. We've mounted it on a piece of MDF, and then we're going to start adding pieces to it one at a time. And I took this one and I started. I did about 4, and I'll show you. So I've got my first 4 on. I put these on the table beside my lathe, so just to be sure that I don't put them on in the wrong order. It sounds like you couldn't do it because they're all different size, but I actually have, if I've just got them in a pile, instead of putting this one on, I've grabbed this one and I've created a little bit of a problem for myself. So do yourself a favor, put them in order, and then you'll take them off in order and put them on your assembly in order. So this is not going to smoke the way my plunge cutting did. And this is something, when I'm making a bowl, I will just leave this right on the lathe, and my lathe is usually dedicated to that task, and I'll just simply go ahead and complete it. I do have a tool rest here somewhere. There it is. So it's important when you're doing this, you want to true up your assembly every time you add a new ring. And that's important to when you're adding the next piece on. If this has any run out in it, you don't know exactly where the next ring should go, and it helps with the alignment. Demonstrators are always supposed to have everything where they know exactly where it is. And yeah. Well, I know I brought it because it was in the car. All right, well, I'll show you this operation here. Kind of medium speed. Always use your face mask. So all I'm doing is just cleaning that up. Oh, I got to backtrack just for a second. Once I've made all these rings, the next step is to go to the drum sander, and that's when it's absolutely essential that you have one, because you cannot plane something as flimsy as this. As I said, it will just get all chewed up in your planer. So I've gone to my drum sander, I've cleaned them all up and made them nice and smooth. But each time I do a glue up, add one onto here, you'll see there's going to be a tiny bit of run out, and you'll probably hear it on the tool until I make it smooth. You can hear just a little bit of, this isn't bad, but you can hear a little bit of ticking, and I'm just trying to take that out. So this surface that I have here is dead flat. Now I really need my sanding tool, and I know it's here. Sorry. Do you know what I'm talking about when I call it, say, my sanding board? Covered with chips. Just a piece of MDF. This is sandpaper that you use on your drum sander. So as you go through and change your the sandpaper on your drum sander, you're going to have pieces at the ends that didn't get as worn as the piece in the middle. Perfect for this. Just glue it on using that spray contact glue. Slow down a little bit. Turn on your dust collector. This is 80 grit paper, and in your drum sander and also here, you don't need to go any finer. I experimented with it and I put higher grit on, and all I did was burn the wood in the drum sander, and I ended up glazing this surface over, so the glue actually didn't stick to it. So coarse sandpaper, it's a little counterintuitive. You think, oh, that joint's got to be perfectly smooth. It needs to be flat, but not perfectly smooth. You'll get a better glue joint if it's just got a tiny bit of roughness. So all you need to do is run this back and forth. That's it. Another essential tool in your shop, and you probably all have one already, is an air compressor. And I'll just blow this off. It'll be satisfactory, but I recommend every time you do a glue joint for segmented turning, you just blow off your surfaces, because if there's any little dust, no matter how fine it is, it will compromise your glue joint a little bit. So. So take the next, always do a dry fit first, because even though the drum sander is pretty good, you can get little snipes in it. And if you've got one, you've got to run it through again to clean it up. This looks pretty good. So apply the glue. Now, a lot of people will tell you, oh, you've got to put glue on both surfaces. And that is true, but what you do here is you rotate the thing. Now, I've got glue on both surfaces. That'll fill in all right. But I also have created a little, just enough adhesion so I don't have to use one hand to hold the piece on while I'm bringing my tailstock up, which is very handy. Determine ahead of time how you want your details to line up. And in this case, I'm taking the last color line here and putting it in the fourth space. And if I'm consistent with that, then my pattern will be maintained all the way around it. So I've got that. And then you can use your fingers to center it. In this case, this, excuse me, I turned the previous ring down just a little bit smaller diameter, but I can feel that with my fingers. So that's pretty well centered. Put a piece of MDF here. Get it more or less centered. It's not exact. And then good old speed clamps. Use these all the time. Put one on and then go 180 degrees, and that will prevent it from, if you started working your way around it, you could end up pushing that ring a little bit out of its alignment. And I usually use 6. 4 is adequate, but I just feel it's slightly more secure. Then you can pull the tailstock away to get the other 2. Excuse me. I did bring 6 of those, yes. Oh, I had one over here. The way you, when you're using the wedgie board and cutting segments, you clamp this onto the fence of your table saw, and that gives you the, so you can repeat the same dimension. And I use this clamp this onto the fence, and then say I wanted 2 inches, so I get my same 2 inches every time. It's a very simple, and it works, repeats very efficiently. So then go around and just check them all to be sure they're snug. You'll see a little bit of glue squeezing out, and that's it. And if you're really in production mode, you only need to leave this for about 20, 25 minutes. You can go ahead with the next one. Half an hour is better, but that's it. So there's about 14 or 15 segments, so this is about a 7-hour elapsed total time of 7 hours or so. Sometimes I'll take it off the lathe and work on something else. Sometimes I'll go and work on another bowl on the table saw. So that's pretty much it. Work all the way down. I haven't done it on that one, but on this one, I used a piece of poplar. This is a waste block. Use a little faceplate. And then when I get down to my last one, I mount I reverse chuck the faceplate, put it on the tailstock and bring it up, glue it on. It's still mounted on a piece of MDF. Let that sit for an hour or so. Cut away the MDF, and then I have the bowl, and I can go ahead and turn it. And I usually rough out the outside first, but you can do it either way. I've got my little helper chart, and I didn't really go over to it. It doesn't. The only reason I did it was to show you that when you're doing your kind of a design work, if you make your rings too thin, you're really limited to a very straight side. If you make them a little bit fatter, you can put a little bit of curve in it. And if you want a bowl like this, it may be a little low for some of you. I can lift it up. If you want to make a shallower bowl that's more open, you'll have to make your rings a lot wider. So it's going to take up more of the wood on your original planks, but you won't need as many rings because the bowl is going to be shallower. The other little quick chart that I did was to show you how important it is to make these angle cuts either on the bandsaw or with the ringmaster or with a parting tool, because if you make these square cuts, and I think YouTube video number 2 that I put on my handout, it's all done with a CNC machine. Obviously he can't make those at an angle because he's using a little teeny router bit, so all those are straight. So he's going to end up making straight cuts. So when you go to turn your bowl, you're going to turn away all these little pieces here and the same ones on the inside. So if you make straight cuts, just be aware that it's going to take a little bit more wood, and you're going to have to make those rings a little bit wider. This is when you angle cut them, and you can see, and from the one that I just demonstrated with, when you lay them all together, it already has the shape of a bowl and a relatively smooth side. So that's the reason for that. So I urge you to make those cuts at an angle. I think that's getting close to the end of what I was going to talk about. Okay, we've got, the other technique is scroll saw, which many of you may have in your shop. Tom Lohman, who does phenomenal work, I urge you to look at that website. The twister bowl, or whatever he calls it, is only one of many, many, many just stunning pieces. He takes a bowl, a plank like this, mounts it on his, drills a tiny little hole to feed a very tiny little scroll saw blade down, and cuts them on his scroll saw. Well, you know how slow a scroll saw cuts with a wide blade. When you're working with a blade that's a 32nd of an inch wide, how long do you think it takes them to just do one of those, let alone 4 or 5? And I tried it, and I just said, this is crazy. I don't have enough time in my life. It's very slow, but it's also very accurate too. So if you are comfortable with your squirrel saw and you like making cuts like that, by all means do it. So the Ringmaster is another way to go, but if you're just going to play around with it, you won't invest in that. So the easiest way I've decided is just doing it on the bandsaw, and then you have two halves that you have to glue together. So okay, you've got all your pieces added to your assembly, and you've put the waste block on it. You've mounted the faceplate. Then you're ready to finish it, and finish it with whatever shape you like. You'll be limited, as they showed on that chart, by the amount of wood you have, but you'll be able to put some nice curves in it. This doesn't have a lot of curve, but it's just enough to make it pleasing to the eye. Some of them that you'll see, like Hal Malitsky's bowls, are stunning, but the sides are rigid, and to me, that's not a pleasing shape. And if you've ever read or listened to Richard Raffin, maybe you've seen him in person, he's very well known, he's from Australia. He said when all the color and everything else is gone, years later, he's not criticizing segmented work for the beauty in the colors of the wood, but he said all wood darkens and eventually all you have is shape. So shape is really important in your piece. So that's why I like to put a little bit of shape in the sides of my bowls. That's it. Then I sand, usually to 400, sometimes 600. There's a lot of interest in our club in using 3408. John, he's here, isn't he? Who's done some demos for us on using 3408. If you don't know, it's a CA glue, but it's really made for finishing. And lots of people in the early days of CA glue were using it on pens and small items, but now it's really it's very user friendly, and you can do it on larger pieces. Frank does all of his using a CA finish. Then he'll sand it with, go over it with steel wool, and then put some poly on it. Some are much brighter, higher gloss, some are lower gloss. I've been using just spray shellac, a couple of coats, sand it way back, then put on wipe on poly. But whatever you like for a finish. You want to be careful with it, because that's really what's going to make your segmented work really stand out and really pop and look nice. So, as I said in my final summary, the concepts here are very simple. They're very straightforward, and after you watch the videos, and they'll be much more better presented than I am up here, because you can go back and listen to it again. But they're all good. You'll learn a lot from them, and then go ahead and try it. And as I said at the beginning, we want to do classes in the club in things that people are interested in. So if there is interest, and several of you have already spoken to me about it, and a couple I've worked with over the past couple of years doing them, I'll be doing classes in segmented work, whatever kind you want, and either at Frank's or at my shop, whichever works out better. So don't hesitate. Come forward, and we'll put a class together. I'll be back by about the 10th of October, and we'll get things going. Anything else? Norm?
What was the grade cut again?
You can make them all 45 if you want, but it's actually a function of how much you index each row. If I generally bring them in about 1/4 inch, but that's also a function of how many boards. And then the relative, if you bring your next row in 1/4 inch and your ring is 1/4 inch thick, it's 45. But you can make it 40, 38, and it's all going to come out pretty well. You'll get the advantage of having the angle cut at any angle in that range, 35 to 45. We're going to be on YouTube? Oh. Oh, okay. Hello, YouTube world. Any other questions? I hope this sparks a little bit of interest and we get a class going.
Is there any finish to help keep it from fading as fast?
I wish I could give you a definitive answer, but yes, there are now finishes that are UV resistant. In the early days, people would just take, sunscreen and put it on them because it actually helped. But I think, and whether CA glue as a finish helps with UV degradation, I don't know. It's too new to know that. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it's something to think about. And I put on my little hang tags that I put on every piece. Do not put in sunlight because all wood will fade over time, as we all know.
I glued up a variety of species about 20 years ago, and there's big mold on it. And the bottom where the faceplate was going, no, it was still sitting in the case, but it's still every day. It wasn't.
Yeah,
Together, everything else is starting quite a bit.
yeah. Some way more than others. I made some lamps out of Purple Heart one time, and they were gorgeous. And today they're brown. So, and each species does react differently to the light. So do a little homework on that too. And the guys here at Advantage are very knowledgeable. They can help you with that. So, hope you all learned something. Hope you all go home with a piece of wood.
Have you ever varied the width of the ring? Varied the angle you cut your rings at so that you can shape your bow differently?
Yes, I have. And
I usually do that on graph paper.
yeah,
You gotta worry about the thickness.
you do. The question is, do you ever have a situation where you want to vary the width of the rings? And yes, if you've got a bowl that's coming down and then gently sloping like this, you've got to have a lot more wood in those lower rings than the upper ones. Because if it's more vertical, you can get by with 1 inch or so, a little less. But when you get down toward the bottom, so you do have to do that in your layout. And a graph paper, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, if you have any question about what you're going to need, just do a layout. You can buy all kinds of computer programs for segmented work now, but short of that, a piece of graph paper has always worked. And they're good ones. Look online for some of them, the programs. But yes, you will want wider rings as you get near the bottom. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Okay. Sorry. Raffle? Take it.
What a raffle, Dave's got some special. All right, so some new stuff.
Oh, okay. Take it, Dave.